Welcome. We are continuing with Ulladu Narpadu or Saddarshanam, and we are on verse number 17. The next five verses are talking about the truth of what the body is or what the world is, which are all connected, and how it is seen when one is in ignorance, and how the same is perceived when one abides in true self knowledge. So, verse 17. உடல் நானே தன்னை உணரார்க்கு உணர்ந்தார்க்கு உடல் அளவே நான் தன்னை உணரார்க்கு உடலுள்ளே தன்னை உணர்ந்தார்க்கு எல்லையறத் தான் ஒளிரும் நான் இதுவே இன்னவர்த்தம் வேதமெனவென். What this verse points out is that for both one who has realized his self and one who is ignorant, the body is the self. The only difference, which is a very fundamental difference, is that for one who is ignorant, the body alone is the self, whereas for one who is abiding in self knowledge, there is no boundary to the self, and therefore the body and the entire universe is part of his own self. The essence of this verse is that when one is rooted in the ego, which is the identification that I am the body, then there is a clear division between I and the other, the first person, the second, and the third person. And therefore, one takes oneself to be the body, as the I, as the self, and the other as the other. And therefore, out of that separation, that division, there is all the psychological problems of desire, suffering, comparison, jealousy, and all of it that comes forth. Whereas if one realizes that it is the same energy that is manifesting as this body, as any other body, as all matter, or as every single atom in the universe, and everything functions with the same pure consciousness, then this identification with the body as the self is uprooted, and what is seen is a recognition that pure consciousness, which makes everything possible, is alone our true nature, our divine nature. And in that, the body is not excluded, it is included. Other bodies are included. The whole universe is included. Therefore, the self realization or the state of self realization is not something that is exclusive or otherworldly, but it is inclusive of everything there is. And therefore, another way to put it is that self realization is a state of perfect love where there is no sense of otherness and everything is considered as one's own self. This is all summarized beautifully when once someone asked Ramana Maharshi, how should we treat others? And anyone who looks at it from the standpoint of morality, of right and wrong, can come up with any number of ways to answer that. But from the true standpoint of self-realization, which is what Ramana Maharshi was always talking from, he simply said, when asked how should we treat others, he said, there are no others. So in that state, when there are no others, when everyone is seen as one's own body, one's own self, is the state of pure love, pure realization, and pure peace. That's what this verse points to. The next verse, verse number 18, extends this from the body to the world, which we already mentioned. The verse is உலகுண்மை ஆகும் உணர்வில்லார்க்கு உள்ளார்க்கு உலகளவாம் உண்மை உணரார்க்கு உலகினுக்கு ஆதாரம் ஆய் உருவற்று ஆறும் உணர்ந்தார் உண்மை ஈதாகும் பேதம் இவர்க்கு எண். So again, the world is true, just like the body, for both the ignorant and the self-realized. But the difference is that the one who is ignorant considers the world to be an objective reality in and of itself with all its names and forms, whereas the one who is realized sees only the substratum of the world, which is the pure awareness without any division. So, again, what Ramana Maharishi points to in this verse is that the perception of names and forms, which are superimpositions, which come and go, which are impermanent, is taken to be real, and that is considered as the world by one who is caught in ignorance. Whereas if one sees the abiding reality behind the names and forms, and sees the unity behind all the names and forms, the substratum behind the superimposition, then he sees that the entire display, the phenomena of names and forms, which is the world, is nothing but an appearance, and therefore it is real as the substratum. The best example we already saw is how gold, when made into ornaments, is still real as gold, though the ornaments can be formed and unformed. So the one who takes the ornament to be an absolute reality is caught in ignorance, whereas one who sees the world, the gold, which is the substratum, to be the reality, then the ornament falls in its own place, which is to say that it is treated transactionally in the most intelligent way, while its impermanence is always realized, and therefore one doesn't get attached to it while also dealing with it in a loving way. That's again the essence of this verse, which extends the notion of how otherness is rooted in seeing names and forms, one's own body and others as objective reality. And when otherness goes, then there is the unified perception of all that is as one abiding reality. And in that, everything falls in its place, and one simply can deal with everything in that field of divine love. So then what is also pointed out is that when that identification with the body, which is the egoic sense, is uprooted, then the body continues to function, because the body is already functioning just as the various systems in the body are functioning perfectly without any need for the ego, whether it's the digestion or the heart or the lungs or the liver. They're all functioning on their own. And similarly, thought also gets put in its place, and it directly becomes an instrument of God without the ego wanting to claim false ownership. So this is the symbolism behind the flute of Krishna, by the way. A flute is hollow, and when the flute is hollow, beautiful music comes out of it from Krishna. But when there is something blocking the flute, then of course no music can come. There will be sound coming, but not music. And that's exactly what the ego represents, that which blocks the flute from manifesting the divine music of Krishna or of Supreme Being. So then comes the verse on fate and free will, which is also related, because fate and free will are there only as long as one takes oneself to be the ego. So the verse is number 19. விதிமதி மூல விவேகமிலார்க்கே விதிமதி வெல்லும் விவாதம் விதிமதி கட்கோர் முதலாம் தன்னை உணர்ந்தார் அவை தணர்ந்தார் சார்வரோ பின்னும் அவை சாற்று. The meaning of this verse is that fate and free will are only true for those who are attached to the ego. And then they argue whether fate prevails over free will or free will prevails over fate. And this argument is endless. And even people who are well learned, who have studied even Ramana Maharishi, they keep on arguing about it. And they talk about the three karmas, and they talk about how one has doership over one particular type of karma, and so on and so forth. But if we simply see that all doing happens on its own, and the doership is the only reason for the false sense of ego, then there is no argument between fate and free will. The argument comes because when we take up actions, we imagine ourselves to be the doer, and we want a particular result. And when the result manifests, we think our free will has prevailed because the result matches our expectation. And when the result does not match our expectation, we think fate has prevailed. But in reality, it's neither fate nor free will, but it's just the pure destiny of things as they are. There was no doer in the first place, and therefore the false notion that I am the doer and the sense of expectation, and therefore a projection that based on the expectation either free will prevailed or fate prevailed, are all false, because they are all rooted in the false sense of doership. And when that is gone, the whole debate is gone and actions happen on their own. That is the truth behind fate and free will, so simply and so clearly explained by Ramana Maharishi. And then the next two verses talk about God. So we talked about the body, world, free will, and now finally God, because all of these are related in some way. And um, so here, what Ramana Maharishi points out is that just as there are many dualities and triads that come about, the most important of them is the duality between the individual and God. One always looks at the individual and the God as separate, and therefore there is a triad of the devotee, the object of devotion, and the process of devotion. And so that is what he looks into in these two verses very simply and beautifully. So, verse number 20, Kanum Tanevittu Tan Kadavulai Kanal, Kanum Manomayamam Kachidanai Kanum Avan, Tan Kadavul Kandanam Tan Mudalai Tan Mudal Poi, Tan Kadavul Andri Iladal. So, here what Sri Ramana Maharishi points out is that instead of seeing the seer, the seer who is the pure awareness through which everything is seen, instead of inquiring into who is the seer and looking for the seer, instead to look for God outwardly is only an imagination of the mind, and therefore it cannot be ultimately real. And also he says that when the ego goes, and when one realizes that one is non different from God, God alone is, even then one cannot say, I have seen God, because there is no seeing there. So, in both cases, when one is ignorant and one wants to see God as an object of perception, that is rooted in ignorance, because the very seer is God Himself and not any object that is seen that comes and goes. And when that is realized and when the ego is uprooted, then still there is no seeing, because there is only one being, and that being is self-effulgent, and one is, there is no individual separate from that self-effulgent being to see. That's what is the essence of this verse. That said, one important point that Ramana Maharishi has always clarified is that when devotees, out of love and tremendous devotion, take upon worship of a particular form of a sage or an avatar or of God in a personal form, that is of tremendous value. It is not to be taken that because of this verse that somehow that is denied. In fact, that is highly encouraged, because what Ramana Maharishi always points out is that such devotion, which is bhakti, leads to purification of the mind. When one has great love, even for any other person, one realizes that one becomes selfless, one is able to act out of not egoic needs but of caring for the other person. And when that love is toward God, toward Guru, toward the perfect sage or perfect being, free of ego, then naturally that love has this effect of purifying the ego, removing all the selfish tendencies, and prepares the ground, as it were, for the light of wisdom to dawn. And therefore, having this devotion toward a form, even if that form be something that the mind has projected, because every form is ultimately a projection of the mind, and yet, because the form is divine and has this power, being representative of Guru or God, it has the ability through the feeling, the true feeling of divine love, to cleanse our hearts, remove all selfish tendencies, and therefore the light of wisdom can dawn. This is the symbolism, by the way, behind the very famous episode in Krishna's life of him stealing butter. So to those who are dear to him, he goes to their houses, goes into the dark room where they store butter, and takes the butter. And the beautiful symbolism is those who are dear to him, in other words, people who are devoted to God, just the act of devotion invites grace, which is Krishna, who comes into the dark room, which is the cave of the heart inside us, and takes the butter of self knowledge that is always there within all of us and makes it come out. And that's the act of grace, because it is not through mental processes, through intellectual discussions, through dialogues that we can get at it, because all of them are within the realm of objective knowledge. And therefore devotion in fact is highly beneficial in getting rid of this delusion of objective knowledge and getting rid of the egoic tendencies, so that one can prepare the ground and the heart is open for the divine grace to descend. That's the essence of the greatness of devotion. But having said that, what Ramana Maharishi points out is the ultimate state of realization is when that divine light, that butter of self knowledge, is revealed, so that one sees oneself as non different from the beloved, and one gets lost in the beloved, so to speak. There are many songs, in fact, in many traditions, not just the bhajans of India, but the Sufi tradition and many others, where they talk about getting lost in the beloved. And that is this process where, through true love, one completely loses oneself and the ego is lost, and what remains is pure divine being, which is the beloved. And the last verse, which emphasizes this again, is verse 21. It says, தன்னைத்தான் காணல் தலைவன் தன்னை காணல் என்னும் பல நூல் உண்மை என்ன எனின் என்னைத்தான் காணல் எவன் தான் ஒன்றால் காண ஊனாதல் தலைவன் காணலெவன் ஊனாதல் காண். Many books declare that to see oneself and to see God, and in reality, what Ramana Maharshi says is both of them are no seeing at all, because how can one see? Because there is only one thing, pure consciousness, there is no seeing. Therefore, how can one see God? To simply, then he finishes this verse by saying, கடவுளுக்கு ஊனாதல், to become food for God is to see God. So first of all, it's very clear that there are no two selves for me to see myself. And similarly, for me to see God, then God has to be something that is within the object of perception. And therefore, he comes and goes, and therefore, that cannot be the Almighty God either. So, neither can I see myself, which would be a division within myself, nor can I see God. But the reality is, I, the seer, is nothing but his vision. And therefore, it is not to say that the ego ever is wrong. Many people wrongly characterize this notion as I am God, which is an exactly wrong thing to say, because the I that identifies with the body is non existent, is a fake entity, and to call itself as Brahman or God or any of these entities is only going to boost its ego. What is really the process of sadhana is to realize the non-existence of the I there, so that it dies, and what remains is God, which is our true being in the first place. So that's what Ramana Maharishi points to in this verse, that when one frees oneself of all one's conditionings, which includes the conditioning that I am the body, that I am this breath and the life force, that I am these desires and thoughts, that I am these sense perceptions, and and knowledge, and that I am this subtle ego, when all of these are seen as simply coming and going, and therefore not my true nature, and that which is aware of all the coming and going is seen as my true nature, that awareness is the awareness of God, and then the identification with the body and all the other phenomena is lost. And when that is lost, then there is no more seeing. They are all simply offered to God. That is the inner meaning of saying they become food for God. And when they become food for God, then they are all becoming part of this one movement of divine energy, which always it is, but the false idea that I'm separate is gone, so that one is totally in that state of surrender where the body and the mind and everything functions as part of this divine energy without any block, as we saw, and one simply remains as one is. And that is true seeing, not to see in any other way. That's the essence of verse 21. Thank you.